They say no one survives a Wyoming winter alone. But Sarah McGregor didn't have a choice. Not after the avalanche took her husband and left her with 50 head of cattle, a broken windmill, and a barn roof sagging under the weight of December snow. She was burying a dead calf in the frozen dirt when she saw him half covered in white, blood-soaked, still breathing. A stranger, a man with a gun, a badge, and eyes like a wolf that had seen too many winters. She should have left him there. Any other woman might have, but Sarah hadn't cried in over a year, and something about the way his fingers clutched the snow said he wasn't ready to die. Out here, kindness can kill you, but sometimes, so can letting go. What would you have done in Sarah's boots? Leave your thoughts down in the comments, and don't forget to follow for more stories where snow, blood, and second chances all ride the same trail. The wind, a mournful beast, clawed at the corners of Sarah McGregor's small cabin, its voice a constant thrum against the silence that had become her most steadfast companion. Wyoming territory, in the dead heart of winter, was a world bleached of color, buried under a relentless fall of snow. It had been this way for weeks, a white siege that had shrunk Sarah's world to the steam of her own breath in the frigid air and the comforting, familiar scent of pine smoke from her hearth. She was a woman sculpted by this land. In her late 30s, though the lines etched around her eyes and the set of her jaw spoke of a deeper, older acquaintance with hardship, the McGregor Ranch, nestled in a shallow valley that offered scant protection from the elements, was all hers now. Hers to fight for, hers to bleed for, hers to hold on to like the last warm ember in a dying fire. It had been the previous winter when a patch of black ice and a spooked gelding had stolen Tom from her. One moment he was there, his laughter echoing off the frosted pines as he rode out to check the North Range. The next, an emptiness so vast it threatened to swallow her whole. Now, Sarah, with only old Buck, her grizzled, loyal shadow of a dog, tended the cattle, mended the fences, and carried the weight of memory that clung to every beam of the barn, every worn spot on the cabin floor. The blizzard, this current tormentor, had been particularly cruel. Days ago, a monstrous gust, laden with the weight of 1,000 frozen devils, had brought the north section of the cattle shed groaning to its knees. Snow, heavy and wet, had cascaded down, trapping a half-dozen of her best heifers. It had taken her 2 days of back-breaking labor, her muscles screaming in protest, her lungs burning with the icy air, to dig them out. Each swing of the shovel had been a prayer, each rescued animal a small, hard-won victory against the indifferent cruelty of the season. She was running low. The woodpile, once a proud bulwark against the cold, had dwindled to a worrying mound. The hay in the loft, fragrant with the ghosts of summer, would last a few more weeks, perhaps a month if she rationed strictly. The thought of abandoning the ranch, of admitting defeat, sometimes flickered at the edges of her exhaustion. Townsfolk in Laramie had suggested it, their voices soft with pity. She didn't want, but how could she leave? This land, these buildings, they weren't just wood and dirt. They were the last tangible pieces of Tom, the repository of their shared dreams, the silent witnesses to a love that even death couldn't entirely erase. So, to leave would be to let him die a second time. So, she endured. She rose before the sun, her breath pluming in the frigid air of the cabin, and forced down a breakfast of coffee and leftover biscuits. She bundled herself in layers of wool and worn leather. The cold, a familiar enemy she met head-on each day. It was during her ritual check of the north fence line, a task made treacherous by the deep drifts and the biting wind, that she saw it, a dark shape against the blinding white. Unnaturally still, Buck, lumbering faithfully at her heels, let out a low growl, the fur along his spine ridging. Sarah's hand instinctively went to the worn stock of the Winchester she always carried. her heart thumping a sudden, wary rhythm against her ribs. The snow swirled, a dancing white curtain, then parted for a moment, revealing the shape more clearly. A man, sprawled face down, a dark stain spreading like a fatal bloom on the snow beneath him. Her breath hitched. Caution, a lesson learned hard in this unforgiving country, screamed at her. This was no place for accidents. Trouble found you easily enough without you going looking for it. She approached slowly, her rifle held ready, Buck now sniffing the air with a mixture of aggression and unease. Closer now, she could see the details. He was big, dressed in dark, heavy clothing, one arm flung out as if reaching for something. A few feet away, half buried in a fresh drift, lay a Colt Peacemaker, its metal gleaming dully, and beside it, something else glinted. A small, metallic disc, a badge, cracked, but the raised letters were still legible. U.S. Marshal, fugitive apprehension, a bounty hunter. The stain in the snow was blood, a lot of it. Her first thought, sharp and cold as the wind, was of danger. Men like this, they trafficked in violence. He could be tracking someone, or worse, being tracked. What if his enemies were near? What if he was an outlaw himself? The badge, a clever ruse. The sensible thing, the safe thing, would be to leave him, let the storm claim him. Her own survival was precarious enough without inviting more peril into her life. For a moment, she even considered the rope she carried for fence repairs, the urge to secure him, to neutralize any threat. Strong and insistent, he was a problem she didn't need, a burden she couldn't afford. But then she saw the slight tremor that ran through his shoulder, the faintest puff of condensation near his face, almost invisible against the snow. He was alive, barely. The image of Tom, his lifeblood seeping into the frozen ground, flashed through her mind, sharp and agonizing. Could she leave another soul to die alone in this white hell? The fierce independence that kept her going, that same stubborn refusal to yield, now warred with a deeper, more fundamental part of her, the part that understood suffering, the part that still held a flicker of human compassion, however deeply buried beneath layers of grief and self-preservation. Her mother's voice, calm and knowing, echoed from a distant childhood, speaking of herbs and healing, of the duty to aid those in need, no matter the circumstance. Damnation, she whispered to the howling wind. The word, a small, angry puff of steam. The decision, once made, settled in her with a grim resolve. Getting him back to the cabin was an ordeal. He was a dead weight, and Sarah, though strong, found her muscles screaming in protest with every step she dragged him through the knee-deep snow. Buck, sensing her intent, licked the man's frozen face once, then took up a position as if to guard their slow, agonizing retreat. The wind seemed to redouble its efforts, stinging her exposed cheeks, trying to rip the breath from her lungs. Inside the cabin, the sudden warmth was a shock. She maneuvered him onto the rag rug before the hearth, the flames casting flickering shadows over his still form. His face was pale, blue-tinged at the lips, a nasty gash high on his forehead oozing sluggishly. His breathing was shallow, ragged, working with a grim efficiency born of necessity. Sarah stripped off his frozen outer layers. There was another wound, a bloody tear in his left thigh, the fabric of his trousers stiff with frozen blood. She fetched her box of dried herbs, comfrey for the bleeding, willow bark for the pain and fever she knew would come. Remedies her mother had sworn by, passed down through generations of women who knew how to make do and mend. She cleaned the wounds as best she could, her touch surprisingly gentle despite the roughness of her hands, her movements economical. She packed the herbs against the bleeding, bound them tightly with strips of clean linen torn from an old chemise. She coaxed a few sips of lukewarm, honey-sweetened water between his cracked lips. Through it all, She kept his gun, the heavy Colt, on the mantelpiece, well out of his reach, but within hers. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. Hours passed. The storm raged outside, a relentless white fury, but inside, the small cabin was an island of flickering light and relative warmth. Sarah sat in her rocker, mending a torn shirt of Tom's, a habit she couldn't quite break, her gaze drifting often to the still figure on the floor. Buck, after a period of watchful suspicion, his occasional growls rumbling deep in his chest, had finally settled, not by the fire as usual, but near the stranger's makeshift bed, his grizzled head resting on his paws, his ancient eyes fixed on the man. It was a tentative vote of confidence, one Sarah noted with a flicker of surprise. Dogs. They often knew things humans missed. It was near dawn when he finally stirred. A groan, low and pained. Then his eyes fluttered open. They were dark, the color of storm clouds, and for a moment, unfocused. Then they fixed on her, sharp and assessing, with a chilling intensity that made her glad for the distance between them, and for the weight of the rifle leaning near her chair. Where? His voice was a harsh rasp, raw and weak. "My cabin," Sarah said, her own voice calm, steady. She wouldn't show fear, wouldn't show weakness. "You were out in the storm, injured." He tried to sit up, winced, and fell back with a grunt of pain. His gaze swept the small room, taking in the rough-hewn walls, the stone fireplace, the few meager furnishings. Before returning to her, there was no gratitude in those eyes, only a guarded watchfulness. "Name's Mark," he said. The words clipped, offering nothing more. No thank you, no explanation of who he was or what had happened to him. Just the name, dropped like a stone into the quiet room. Sarah nodded slowly. Sarah McGregor. She didn't offer her hand. The air between them was thick with unspoken questions, with a tension that prickled her skin despite the warmth of the fire. She'd saved his life, but he was still a stranger, a man with a gun and a bounty hunter's badge, found bleeding in the snow. And in Wyoming, in the dead of winter, a stranger could be anything. A savior, a desperado, or just another soul fighting a losing battle against the elements. She watched him. This man named Mark, his face stark in the firelight, a map of hardship and something else, something colder and harder, etched into his features. The storm continued its assault on her small sanctuary, but now there was a new kind of storm brewing within its walls, one of human presence, of secrets and survival. And Sarah McGregor, who had thought herself long past surprises, felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. Buck raised his head, thumped his tail once, softly, against the wooden floor, then laid his muzzle back on his paws, still watching the stranger, his ancient wisdom a silent, enigmatic presence in the heart of the storm. The silence that settled after Mark's curt introduction was heavy, thick as the snow, still piling relentlessly against the cabin's stout log walls. Buck, as if sensing the shift, rested his grizzled muzzle on his paws, his ancient eyes fixed on the stranger, a silent, enigmatic guardian in the heart of the storm. For Sarah, the man's presence was a stone dropped into the still, deep well of her solitude, the ripples spreading outwards, disturbing currents she'd thought long dormant. The hours that followed blurred into a rhythm of grim necessity. Mark's initial lucidity soon succumbed to a raging fever. He thrashed on the pallet of blankets she'd arranged for him, his skin burning to her touch, his breath coming in harsh, ragged gasps. The name, Mark, was all she had, and it felt like a poor shield against the raw, untamed force of his illness. Night bled into day and back into night again. The world outside a howling vortex of white. The wind, no longer just a mournful beast, shrieked like a banshee, rattling the shutters, probing for any weakness in her defenses. Snow drifted high against the door, sealing them in, transforming the small cabin into an isolated ark, adrift in a frozen sea. Sarah moved like a phantom, tending the fire, melting snow for water. Her own exhaustion, a dull ache pushed to the background by the immediacy of Mark's needs. She spooned thin broth, made from her dwindling stores of dried vegetables and a precious knuckle of smoked ham, between his cracked lips when he could swallow, her movements economical, her face a mask of weary resolve. In his delirium, words clawed their way from him, fragmented, harsh, laced with a pain that went deeper than his physical wounds. Clay, he'd rasp, his head thrashing on the makeshift pillow. The boy! God, the boy. Too late. Always too late. Sarah, sponging his brow with cool water, would freeze, her blood running cold despite the cabin's oppressive heat. Clay, the boy. The words echoed the grim purpose etched on the cracked badge she'd found, now tucked safely away in her locked sewing box. A bounty hunter, a man who hunted other men. The realization settled uneasily in her gut. The man she was nursing back from the brink, whose life lay fragile in her hands, was steeped in a world of violence she could scarcely imagine. What darkness had he carried into her home? And who was Clay? What had happened to the boy? Her hand, holding the cloth, would still, her gaze drawn to his face. Harsh, even in illness, lines of pain and something harder, something unforgiving, etched around his mouth and eyes. Suspicion, cold and sharp, pricked at her, a counterpoint to the grudging compassion that kept her tending him. He was a danger, an unknown quantity, yet to abandon him now, in this state, was unthinkable. Tom wouldn't have, and her mother's teachings, of mercy and duty, were too deeply ingrained. So, she pushed her fears aside, attributing the dark mutterings to the fever's cruel tricks, and continued her vigil. After what felt like an eternity, the fever finally broke. It left Mark weak, hollow-eyed, but lucid. He lay staring up at the rough-hewn beams of the ceiling, the fight gone out of him, replaced by a profound weariness that mirrored her own. Sarah sat by the fire, mending a tear in one of Tom's old flannel shirts. The rhythmic pull of needle and thread, a small, comforting anchor in the uncertainty. The silence in the cabin was different now, no longer just the absence of sound, but a space filled with unspoken questions. Finally, his voice, raspy but clear, broke the quiet. The storm, still at it, seems to be settling some, she replied, not looking up from her mending. But we're snowed in good and proper. No getting out for a while yet. He was quiet for a long moment. She could feel his gaze on her. You saved my life. It wasn't a question, but a flat statement. You were freezing to death, she said simply. Couldn't leave a man out in that. Another silence. Then, you heard me when I was out of my head. Sarah's needle stilled. She looked at him then, met his searching gaze. Some talk of a man named Clay, and a boy. A shadow passed over his face, darkening his eyes. He pushed himself up a little, wincing as his thigh protested. Clay Barker, he said, his voice hardening. He's the reason I was out there. The reason for this. He gestured to his bandaged leg. He killed a boy, Sarah, a rancher's son, down near the border, during a robbery. Just snuffed him out. The words were stark, brutal. Sarah felt a chill creep through her, colder than any draft from the storm. So, her suspicions had been true. This man, Mark, hunted killers. She felt a strange mix of emotions, a distant empathy for the lost boy and his family, a fresh wave of anger that this violence had, however indirectly, found its way to her doorstep, and a cold knot of fear. She was harboring a man whose trade was death, whose enemies could be as ruthless as he was. He got the drop on me, Mark continued, his voice low. Flat? Ambushed me. I thought I'd lost him in the storm, but he was waiting. He paused, his gaze turning inward, replaying the memory. I managed to wound him, I think, but he left me for dead. And this, Clay Barker? Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. Where is he now? Mark's eyes met hers, and the look in them was chilling. Out there, somewhere. If he figures I'm still alive, and knows where I hold up, he might come looking to finish the job, and that puts you in danger too. Ma'am. The ma'am was a stark reminder of the distance between them, the formality a thin veil over the raw reality of their situation. Her cabin, her sanctuary, had become a potential battleground. The thought was terrifying. For weeks, her fight had been against the elements, against loneliness, against the fading of memory. Now, a new, more tangible threat loomed. Yet, as the days of their enforced confinement wore on, a strange, almost imperceptible shift began to occur. The tension remained, a live wire humming beneath the surface of their interactions. But other, quieter currents began to flow. Survival demanded a certain level of cooperation, a reluctant truce. There were long hours when Marka, still weak but growing stronger, would simply watch her as she went about her chores, kneading dough for biscuits, checking her dwindling supplies, mending clothes. His gaze was unsettling, intense, but she refused to be cowed by it, moving with the quiet dignity that was her hallmark. Sometimes, when the silence stretched too thin, or when the shadows in the corners of the cabin seemed to deepen with his unspoken pain, Sarah would read aloud. She had a few treasured books, Tom's favorites mostly, well-worn volumes of poetry, a history of the territories, even a tattered collection of Shakespeare. She chose a book of Mark Twain's stories one evening, her voice soft but clear in the firelit room, hoping the humor might lighten the oppressive atmosphere. She wasn't sure if Mark was listening. His eyes were often closed, but he didn't tell her to stop. And once, during a particularly wry passage, she thought she saw the faintest ghost of a smile touch his lips. He, in turn, offered his own brand of practicality. He showed her how to reinforce the makeshift latch on the shed door, where the wind had been worrying it loose. He explained the subtle signs of an approaching wolf pack, how their howls changed, and demonstrated, using twigs on the cabin floor, a more effective way to set a snare. One afternoon, the small generator Tom had rigged up to power a single electric lamp sputtered and died. Sarah had fiddled with it for an hour, her frustration mounting, before Mark, propped against the wall, offered a gruff suggestion about a clogged fuel line. He talked her through, cleaning it, his instructions precise, and when the lamp finally flickered back to life, casting a steady, welcome glow, a small, shared victory lightened the air between them. These moments were islands in a sea of uncertainty. They didn't talk much about his past, or hers. The ghosts were too numerous, too close. But in the shared tasks, in the quiet companionship born of necessity, the sharp edges of their initial wariness began to soften, just a little. One particularly cold afternoon, Sarah was sorting through a chest of Tom's old clothes, looking for something, anything, that might offer Mark an extra layer of warmth. His own clothes were still damp and stiff. Despite her efforts to dry them near the fire, she pulled out a heavy woolen sweater, one she'd knitted for Tom years ago, a deep forest green. It was thick, a bit shapeless from wear, but warm. Here, she said, holding it out to Mark. This might fit. It'll be warmer than what you've got. He looked at the sweater, then at her, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. He took it slowly. You sure? No use to anyone packed away in a chest, she said, trying for a lightness she didn't quite feel. Giving away Tom's things, even for a practical purpose, still sent a pang through her. Mark struggled to pull the sweater over his head and broad shoulders. It was a tight fit, a very tight fit. The wool stretched taut across his chest. The sleeves ended a good 2 inches above his wrists, and the bottom barely reached his belt. He looked down at himself, then up at Sarah, a flush creeping up his neck. He looked utterly, unexpectedly, ridiculous, and Sarah laughed. It wasn't a small chuckle, or a polite titter. It was a full, genuine laugh, bubbling up from somewhere deep inside her, a sound she hadn't realized she'd missed so profoundly. It was rusty, a little shaky at first. Then it gained strength, echoing in the small cabin, chasing away the shadows for a precious moment. Mark just stood there, looking more uncomfortable by the second, the tips of his ears now a bright red. "Reckon your husband was a smaller man," he mumbled, trying to tug the hem down, which only made it look worse. The laughter eased from Sarah, leaving a lightness in its wake, a warmth that spread through her chest. "He was," she said, a soft smile playing on her lips, the memory of Tom, for once, bringing not just pain, but a gentle fondness, a good deal smaller. She took the sweater from him. Well, it was a thought, but something had shifted. The sound of her own laughter, so long absent, had changed the air in the cabin. It felt different, less empty. The walls, which had seemed to press in on her with their memories and her solitude, suddenly felt a little less confining. There was another presence here, a difficult, dangerous presence, perhaps, but a living, breathing one, and for the first time since the snow had begun to fall, Sarah McGregor didn't feel quite so alone. The hearth, at least for now, felt a little warmer. The shared laughter over the ill-fitting sweater, a fragile bloom of warmth in the frozen landscape of their confinement, lingered in the cabin air like the scent of wood smoke, subtle yet pervasive. It didn't banish the shadows, nor the unspoken knowledge of the danger Mark represented, but it had nudged open a door, letting in a sliver of light, a hint of shared humanity. For a few days, a quiet rhythm established itself, punctuated by the necessities of survival and the slow mending of Mark's wounds. He was still a long way from healed, but the fever was a memory, and a measure of his formidable strength was returning, evident in the growing restlessness in his dark eyes. Then, it stopped, as if weary of its own fury, paused. The relentless wind softened to a whisper, and the snowfall ceased, leaving behind a world sculpted in blinding white, pristine and eerily silent. The quiet was almost more unsettling than the howl of the blizzard. It was a quiet that felt watchful. "Need to check the stock," Sarah announced after a sparse breakfast of coffee and day-old biscuits. Her voice was practical, but a new unease prickled beneath the surface. See if the shed roof held up any better this time. Mark, propped against the wall, his injured leg stretched out stiffly, nodded. "Be careful. Quiet like this. It can be deceiving." His gaze was distant, scanning the snow-laden landscape visible through the small, frost-rimed window. "Always am," she said, pulling on her heavy coat and Tom's old fur-lined hat. Buck, ever loyal, rose stiffly from his spot by the hearth, ready to accompany her. The air outside was sharp, clean, biting at her cheeks. The snow lay deep, sculpted by the wind into fantastical drifts and hollows. As Sarah made her way towards the cattle shed, Buck trotting ahead, she felt a strange reluctance, a premonition she couldn't quite shake. The laughter from days before felt like a distant dream. It was Buck who alerted her first. He stopped abruptly near the north wall of the shed. His ears pricked, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Sarah's hand instinctively went to the small axe she'd tucked into her belt. The Winchester was too cumbersome for close-quarters work around the animals. Then she saw them, footprints, not her own, nor the familiar, splayed tracks of a wolf or coyote. These were man-sized, distinct in the freshly smoothed snow. leading from the shelter of the pines towards the shed, circling it, then heading back towards the dense woods. Her heart began a slow, heavy thud. With a growing sense of dread, she forced open the shed door, its frozen hinges groaning in protest. The cattle stirred, their breath pluming in the cold air, and there, in the far stall, lay one of her youngest calves, dead, not from cold, not from sickness. A dark stain bloomed on its pale winter coat, and when Sarah knelt, her stomach churning, she saw the wound. A clean, deliberate slice across its throat, not the ragged tear of a predator's teeth. This was a knife's work, a warning, or worse, a sign of scouting. She backed out of the shed slowly, her breath catching in her throat. The silence of the snow-covered world now seemed menacing, pregnant with unseen threats. She hurried back to the cabin, Buck at her heels. His earlier unease, now a palpable tension. Mark knew the instant he saw her face. The carefully constructed calm she usually wore had been stripped away, revealing the stark fear beneath. "What is it?" he asked, his voice sharp, already reaching for the Colt peacemaker she'd returned to him once his fever broke, keeping it always within his reach on the small table beside his pallet. Her words came out in a rush, describing the footprints, the slaughtered calf, the unnatural stillness of the wound. He listened, his expression grim, his eyes like chips of dark ice. "Barker," he said. The name, a curse. Or his men. "They're close. Testing. Seeing who's here." He swore under his breath. A harsh, bitter sound. "I brought this to your door, Sarah." There was no time for recriminations, no time for the fear that threatened to paralyze her. The fragile peace was shattered. The enemy was no longer a shadowy figure from Mark's past, but a tangible presence, circling her sanctuary. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "We watch," he said, "and we wait. They'll be back. They won't leave a witness. Not if they think I'm alive and know they're here." He checked the action of his Colt, his movements economical and deadly. "Keep that rifle of yours handy, and stay away from the windows." The day crawled by, each hour laden with a suffocating tension. The brief respite from the storm was a cruel mockery, offering no escape, only a clearer view of their isolation. Sarah found herself jumping at every creak of the cabin logs, every sigh of the wind. She tried to busy herself with small tasks, but her hands trembled, and her gaze kept straying to the snow-covered expanse outside, searching for any sign of movement. Mark remained still, watchful, a coiled spring of dangerous energy. Late afternoon, as the pale sun began to dip towards the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows across the snow, they came, 3 figures on horseback, emerging slowly from the tree line, dark silhouettes against the bruised purple of the twilight sky. They weren't charging, weren't overtly threatening, but there was a predatory stillness about them that sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. They stopped at the rickety gate to her small yard, perhaps 50 yards from the cabin. One of them, a burly man with a thick, unkempt beard, dismounted. "Hello, the house," he called out, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Got a couple of lost travelers here. Storms caught us out. Wondering if you might spare a bit of shelter for the night. Maybe some coffee." Sarah moved towards the door, her instinct for frontier hospitality warring with the cold dread in her heart. Perhaps they were just what they claimed to be. It wasn't unheard of, but Mark's hand shot out, gripping her arm. His touch was like iron. "No," he whispered, his voice flinty. "Don't open it." His eyes were fixed on the men, narrowed and cold as a winter river, the one on the far right. He breathed, his lips barely moving. The tall, skinny one. Name's Pike. Rode with Barker for a year. I'd know that slouch anywhere. Sarah's blood ran cold. Pike, one of Clay Barker's gang. Her hand tightened on the stock of the Winchester she now held. "What do we do?" she mouthed, her throat dry. "Play it calm," Mark instructed, his gaze unwavering. "Tell them you're sorry, but you're low on supplies yourself. Barely enough for one. Tell them there's a small settlement, Patterson's Creek, about 10 miles east. They might find help there." He knew, and she knew, that Patterson's Creek was little more than a couple of abandoned trappers' cabins, and in this snow, 10 miles was an impossible journey. It was a dismissal, clear and cold. Sarah took a deep breath, stepped closer to the door, but did not unlatch it. "Sorry. Strangers," she called out, pitching her voice to sound firm, a little weary. "Afraid I can't help you. Barely got enough for myself here. With this storm, there's Patterson's Creek, about 10 miles east. Might find something there." The bearded man at the gate stared at the cabin for a long moment. Sarah could feel his scrutiny, even through the solid wood. Then he shrugged, turned back to his companions, and after a brief, low-voiced consultation, they mounted up and slowly rode back the way they had come, disappearing into the darkening woods. But neither Sarah nor Mark believed for a second they were truly gone. "They'll be back," Mark stated, his voice grim. "Tonight, under cover of darkness. They know someone's here, and they'll want to know who, and they'll want whatever supplies you have." The cabin, once a sanctuary, now felt like a trap. They made what preparations they could. Mark, despite the searing pain it clearly caused him, positioned himself near the main window, his Colt resting on the sill, his eyes scanning the moonlit snow. Sarah barricaded the door as best she could with a heavy chest, her own rifle loaded and ready beside her. She doused the main lamp, leaving only the flickering embers in the hearth to cast dancing, uncertain shadows. Buck, sensing the gravity of the situation, lay by the door, a low, almost inaudible growl vibrating in his chest. The hours passed in an agony of suspense. Every rustle of the wind in the pines, every skitter of a mouse in the walls, sounded like an approaching footstep. Sarah's nerves were stretched taut as a bowstring. It was well past midnight when the attack came. Not at the cabin door, as they'd half expected, but at the cattle shed, a sudden, sharp crack of splintering wood, followed by the frightened lowing of the cattle. "They're after the animals, or creating a diversion," Mark hissed, already moving, his injured leg dragging but his purpose clear. Sarah didn't hesitate. Rage, cold and fierce, surged through her, overriding her fear. Those were her animals, her livelihood, the last vestiges of the life she and Tom had built. She grabbed a sturdy pitchfork that leaned near the door, its tines gleaming wickedly in the dim light. "I'm not letting them." Before Mark could protest, she was out the door, Buck barking furiously at her side, hurtling towards the shed. Two figures were inside, their dark shapes moving against the lesser darkness. One was trying to bridle a panicked heifer. The other was smashing at the fence rails of a stall with a heavy club. "Get away from them," Sarah screamed, her voice raw with fury. She lunged, driving the pitchfork with all her strength into the side of the man with the club. He roared in pain and surprise, stumbling back, clutching his ribs, the club clattering to the frozen ground. A shot rang out from the direction of the cabin. The second man, the one wrestling with the heifer, cried out and crumpled, a dark stain blossoming on his chest. Mark, framed in the cabin doorway, his Colt smoking in the moonlight. The first man, the one Sarah had stabbed, scrambled to his feet, his face contorted in a mask of pain and hate. He lunged for her, but Buck, brave old Buck, threw himself at the man's legs, sinking his teeth into a denim-clad calf. The man howled again, kicking out viciously, sending Buck tumbling back with a yelp of pain. That yelp galvanized Sarah. She raised the pitchfork again, but before she could strike, the third man, Pike, Mark had called him, appeared at the shed entrance, his gun drawn. Time seemed to slow. Sarah saw the glint of his gun barrel, the cruel twist of his lips. She braced herself. Then another shot, deafeningly close. Pike's eyes widened in shock. His gun clattered from his grasp, and he pitched forward into the snow. Still, Mark stood a few feet away, leaning heavily against the doorframe of the shed, his face pale and beaded with sweat, his Colt still aimed at the fallen man. He'd managed to close the distance despite his leg. Silence descended, broken only by Sarah's harsh breathing, the whimpering of Buck, and the terrified bellows of the cattle. The sharp, acrid smell of gunpowder hung heavy in the frigid air. It was over. 2 men lay dead in the snow and mud of her cattle shed. The third had vanished, presumably the man who had been keeping watch or had fled when the shooting started. Mark sagged against the wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his face etched with pain and exhaustion. Sarah rushed to Buck, who was licking at a shallow gash on his foreleg. Relief, sharp and fierce, washed through her when she saw it wasn't deep. Then, the adrenaline drained away, leaving her trembling. Weak-kneed, she looked at the carnage around her. The dead men, the terrified animals, the splintered wood of her fences, and for the first time since Tom's death, Sarah McGregor wept, not from fear, but from a deep, shuddering rage at the violation, at the brutal intrusion into her life, at the sheer, crushing weight of it all. Tears of helplessness, of fury, streamed down her face, freezing on her cheeks in the bitter cold. Mark pushed himself upright, his face a grim mask. "We need to deal with this," he said, his voice hoarse, gesturing to the bodies. Together, in the pre-dawn gloom, they dragged the 2 corpses away from the shed, out into the open field beyond the broken fence line. The ground was frozen solid, digging impossible, so they covered them with snow, piling it high, creating 2 anonymous mounds in the vast white expanse. Mark found a couple of broken fence posts and drove them into the snow as grim markers. The work was hard, brutal, and performed in a near-total, exhausted silence. The eastern sky was beginning to pale with the first hint of dawn when they finally finished. Back in the cabin, the warmth felt oppressive. Sarah sank onto a stool, her body aching, her mind numb. Buck lay at her feet, thumping his tail weakly when she stroked his head. "We should report this to the sheriff in Laramie," Mark said, his voice devoid of inflection. He was cleaning his Colt with an oiled rag, his movements precise despite the tremor in his hands. Sarah shook her head. "No." He looked up, his dark eyes questioning. "The snow's still too deep between here and Laramie," she said, her voice flat with exhaustion. "It's a dangerous ride, even without this." She gestured vaguely towards the door. "And they'll ask questions. Too many questions. About you." She met his gaze, a new, hard resolve in her own. "They were on my land. They attacked my property. My animals. They threatened me." She paused. This was my fight too. She wouldn't expose him. Not after this. He'd saved her life, just as she had saved his. They were bound now, not by choice, but by shared blood and shared survival in the unforgiving heart of a Wyoming winter. The enemies in the shadows had been met, and though the battle was won, Sarah knew, with a chilling certainty, that the war was far from over. What did you think of today's story? If it made your day, drop a good in the comments. If it didn't hit the mark, just type 1. Got your own thoughts? I'd love to hear them below. And hey, don't forget to hit subscribe. It's free, and it really helps the channel grow. Thank you so much for being here. The decision, once made, settled between Sarah and Mark. With the weight of unspoken vows, there would be no sheriff, no questions from outsiders, The dead men under the snow were a grim secret shared, a testament to the brutal turn their enforced isolation had taken. The raw edge of violence had scraped away any remaining pretense of normalcy, leaving them bound by the shared experience of survival. Their small cabin, a fortress against a world that had suddenly shown its teeth. Days bled into weeks. The relentless grip of winter began, almost imperceptibly, to loosen. The sun, when it showed its face, held a hint more warmth, and the icicles hanging from the cabin eaves wept slow, steady tears during the brief midday thaw. Snow still lay heavy across the land, a vast white blanket, but here and there, on south-facing slopes or where the wind had scoured the ground bare, patches of frozen earth began to emerge like bruises on the pale skin of the landscape. Mark, with a grim determination that matched Sarah's own, pushed himself through the lingering pain of his wounds. He fashioned a crude crutch from a sturdy tree branch and, with its aid, began to move about more freely, first within the confines of the cabin, then venturing out into the small, snow-packed yard. His strength returned slowly, a testament to his iron will. Each morning, Sarah would hear the sharp, distinct crack of his Colt Peacemaker as he practiced, his silhouette stark against the winter sky. He'd set up tin cans on a distant fence post, and with each session, the rhythm of his shots grew steadier, his aim more sure. It was a chilling sound, a constant reminder of the danger that still lurked. Yet there was a strange comfort in it too, a sign that they were not entirely defenseless. Together, they worked to mend the damage from the attack. They repaired the splintered fence rails of the cattle shed, their hands often brushing, their movements falling into an easy, unspoken rhythm. Sarah, her initial fear and rage now banked into a cold, hard resolve, learned from Mark how to set snares along the perimeter of the ranch, not just for wolves this time, but for two-legged predators. He showed her the weak points, the blind spots, the places where an attacker might try to gain an advantage. He spoke little, his instructions curt and practical, but his eyes, when they met hers, held a new respect, an acknowledgement of the steel he'd found beneath her quiet exterior. They existed in a bubble of shared vigilance, the outside world a distant memory. The unspoken truth hung heavy in the air between them. Clay Barker was still out there. He had lost men, but he was not the type to forgive or forget. He would be back. The thawing snow, the lengthening days, they weren't just signs of approaching spring. They were a countdown. One evening, as a fragile thaw dripped from the eaves and the fire cast flickering shadows on the cabin walls, Sarah found herself looking at an old, leather-bound journal of Tom's. She hadn't opened it in months. Now, her fingers traced the worn cover. "Tom, he left me a letter," she said softly, not looking at Marky, who sat across the small room, oiling the mechanism of his rifle. The admission surprised her. She hadn't intended to speak of it. Mark's hands stilled. He didn't speak, but his attention was wholly on her. It was tucked inside this journal. She continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Found it a few weeks after he passed. He must have written it a while before." She paused, swallowing against a familiar ache. There was a line in it. "I keep thinking about it." She opened the journal, her fingers finding the folded, slightly yellowed page. She didn't need to read it. The words were etched in her memory. "One day, Sarah girl," he wrote, "you might meet someone who's lost their way, someone who needs a helping hand. Same as I did when you found me half froze and near starved all those years ago. If that day comes, you help them like you helped me." Her voice trembled slightly on the last words. She looked up then, met Mark's steady gaze. "When I found you, out there in the snow." Those words, they came back to me, made me wonder if your coming here wasn't just an accident. If maybe. She trailed off, unable to articulate the nebulous feeling, the sense of a thread, however faint, connecting her past with this dangerous present. Mark said nothing for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the dim light. Then, he nodded slowly. Maybe some things are meant to be. Sarah, he said, his voice rough. Even the hard things. It wasn't an absolution, nor a denial, but an acknowledgement that resonated deep within her. The trust between them, fragile as the first spring ice, solidified a little more. It wasn't a soft, easy trust, but one forged in shared hardship, tempered by the ever-present threat of violence. The second storm arrived with the treacherous unpredictability of a cornered animal. One day, the air was soft with the promise of spring. The next, the sky turned a malevolent, bruised purple, and the wind rose to a furious howl, driving a fresh onslaught of sleet and snow before it. It was as if winter, in its dying throes, was determined to unleash one last, vicious assault. "He'll use the storm," Mark said, his voice flat, as they watched the white fury engulf the world outside. Just like I would. They didn't have to wait long. The attack, when it came, was swift and brutal, a coordinated assault designed to overwhelm. It began with a splintering crash from the rear of the cabin, the small, seldom used back door giving way. Simultaneously, a commotion erupted from the cattle shed. Shouts, the terrified bawling of her animals. 2, maybe 3, Mark grunted, already moving towards the main room, his Colt steady in his hand, his limp less pronounced now, his body honed by weeks of grim preparation. One at the back, one in the shed. Barker will try the front. Thinking we're distracted, his prediction was chillingly accurate. As Sarah grabbed her Winchester, her heart hammering against her ribs, the main cabin door burst inward, and Clay Barker stood framed in the opening, a cruel smile twisting his lips. He was bigger than she'd imagined, an aura of raw, menacing power emanating from him. Snow swirled around him, and behind him, she caught a glimpse of another figure, holding back in the storm. Well, Barker sneered, his eyes, cold and reptilian, fixing on Sarah. Looks like the bounty hunter found himself a cozy little nest and a nursemaid. He took a step into the room, his gun leveled. "Shame it's gotta end this way for you, ma'am." Before Sarah could react, before Mark, who was concealed by the angle of the short hallway leading to the back, could make his move, Barker lunged. He was terrifyingly fast for a man his size. He grabbed Sarah, yanking her in front of him as a shield, the cold muzzle of his gun pressing hard against her temple. "Drop it, Marshal," Barker roared, his voice raspy. "Or the lady gets it first." Fear, cold and sharp, lanced through Sarah, but beneath it, something else stirred. A white-hot fury. This man, this monster who had killed a child, who had brought violence and death to her doorstep, would not use her, would not win. Her eyes darted to the old, dry sink near the hearth, its wooden countertop scarred and worn. Tucked inside the shallow utensil drawer, beneath a pile of mismatched cutlery, lay a small, .32 caliber revolver Tom had kept for emergencies. She'd cleaned it, loaded it, and placed it there herself days ago. A desperate, last-ditch measure. A secret known only to her. Barker, his attention fixed on where he assumed Mark would appear. "Wouldn't expect it. Couldn't," I said. "Drop it," Barker snarled, tightening his grip on Sarah, his gun pressing harder into her skin. With a sudden, desperate surge of strength, Sarah stomped down hard on Barker's instep with the heel of her sturdy boot. He grunted in pain, his grip loosening infinitesimally. It was all she needed. She twisted, ducking under his arm, shoving away from him even as her hand shot out, yanking open the drawer. Her fingers closed around the cold, familiar butt of the revolver. She didn't hesitate, didn't aim, just brought the gun up and fired, the shot deafening in the confines of the small cabin. Barker screamed, a raw, animalistic sound, and stumbled back, clutching his leg where a dark stain was already blossoming on his trousers. His gun clattered to the floor. In that same instant, Mark exploded into the room from the side. Not the back hallway, as Barker had anticipated, but from the narrow door leading to the small, lean-to storage area where Sarah kept her preserves and extra firewood. He must have circled around. He launched himself at the wounded outlaw, a guttural roar tearing from his throat. The two men crashed to the floor, a maelstrom of desperate, brutal violence. The other man, outside, momentarily stunned by the shot, now charged in, but Sarah, her own gun still smoking, whirled and fired again. The man yelped, clutching his shoulder, and stumbled back out into the storm. The fight between Mark and Barker was savage. They rolled across the floor, grunts and curses tearing from their throats, fists landing with sickening thuds. Barker, despite his wounded leg, fought with the ferocity of a cornered wolf. He managed to draw a wicked-looking hunting knife. The fight spilled towards the lean-to, which also served as a passage to the hay storage area. More a sturdy, enclosed barn than a simple loft. Connected to the main cabin by that narrow doorway, it was packed tight with the last of her precious winter feed. A kerosene lamp, its wick sputtering, hung precariously from a nail near the entrance to the hay storage. In the struggle, one of them, Sarah couldn't see who, slammed against the wall. The lamp swayed violently, then crashed to the floor, shattering. The burning oil igniting the scattered, dry as tinder hay at the entrance. Flames erupted with terrifying speed, orange and hungry, licking up the dry wooden walls of the passage, racing towards the main store of hay. Mark, Sarah screamed, smoke already stinging her eyes, the roar of the fire growing louder. Inside the narrow confines of the burning passageway, the fight continued, silhouetted against the growing inferno. Sarah could see them, two dark shapes locked in a deadly embrace. The glint of Barker's knife, Mark's desperate attempts to fend him off. The cattle in the nearby shed, smelling the smoke, began to bellow in terror. The man at the back of the cabin, whoever he was, seemed to have given up. His sounds fading into the storm, Sarah knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that Mark couldn't win like this, not with his still mending wounds, not with Barker's desperate, pain-fueled strength, and the fire. The fire would consume everything, them included. Her hay, her precious hay, the last of it. The only thing that stood between her herd and starvation before the spring grasses came. To lose it was to lose everything Tom had worked for, everything she had fought to preserve. But to lose Mark, the decision, agonizing and instant, tore through her. She grabbed another oil lamp from the cabin table, its flame burning steadily. Her hands were shaking, but her resolve was like granite. She ran to the entrance of the hay storage, the heat already intense, smoke billowing out, choking her. Mark, get him further in. She screamed over the roar of the flames. She didn't know if he heard her, but then she saw Barker stumble back, deeper into the hay storage, Mark pressing him, using the confined space. This was her only chance, her only sacrifice left to make. With a sob that was ripped from the very depths of her soul, Sarah hurled the burning lamp deep into the heart of the hay. The effect was instantaneous. The dry hay exploded into a monstrous conflagration, a roaring inferno that lit up the night, turning the swirling snow outside to a hellish orange. Now, Mark, now, through the smoke and flames, she saw them. Barker, momentarily blinded and choking, screamed as the fire enveloped the space around him. Marks, using that distraction, lunged. There was a final, desperate struggle, the glint of Barker's knife falling, Then Mark broke free, stumbling back, dragging himself towards a small, seldom used rear door of the hay barn, one that led out to the far pasture. He kicked it open, smoke and flames billowing out around him, then turned, reaching back into the inferno. For a horrifying second, Sarah thought he was going back for Barker, but then she reappeared, dragging the now limp form of the outlaw with him, pulling him clear just as a terrifying groan echoed from within the structure. Sarah ran towards them, heedless of the sparks and falling embers. With a sound like the death cry of some great beast, the main roof beams of the hay barn gave way. The entire structure sagged, then collapsed inward in a shower of sparks and a geyser of flame, sending a column of black smoke boiling into the storm-tossed sky. Mark lay on the snow-covered ground, gasping for air, his face blackened with soot, his clothes singed. Beside him, Clay Barker lay still, his eyes wide and unseeing, a dark, ornate knife hilt protruding from his chest. Sarah fell to her knees beside Mark, her body trembling, her lungs aching from the smoke. He was alive. She had saved him. But as she looked at the roaring pyre that had once been her hope for her herd, a wave of desolation washed over her. The snow was melting, but her world had just been scorched. The final battle had been won, but the cost was a devastation she was only just beginning to comprehend. The acrid smell of burnt hay and charred wood hung heavy in the air, a bitter counterpoint to the clean, cold scent of the lingering storm. Dawn broke pale and indifferent, painting the bruised sky with strokes of gray and watery pink, illuminating the devastation. The hay barn, the repository of Sarah's hopes for surviving the winter, was a smoking, skeletal ruin, its blackened timbers stark against the snow-dusted landscape. Clay Barker lay still, a final, grim testament to the violence that had erupted under the cover of the blizzard. Sarah knelt beside Mark, her hand resting lightly on his arm, feeling the tremors of exhaustion that shook his frame. Smoke stained his face. His clothes were torn and scorched, but his eyes, when they met hers, held a weary clarity. They had survived. The cost was etched in the smoldering ruins before them, a price that felt impossibly high. Buck whined softly, limping over to lick Mark's hand. Then Sarah's, a small, comforting presence in the bleak tableau. There were grim tasks to attend to. Barker's body, along with the man Sarah had shot outside the cabin door, who had succumbed to his wounds and the cold, joined the other two beneath the snow, their temporary graves marked by the rough fence posts, silent warnings in the vast, indifferent white. There was no triumph in it, only a profound, aching weariness and the hollow echo of violence, as the storm finally blew itself out, replaced by a fragile, crystalline sunlight. A new quiet settled over the ranch. It wasn't the watchful silence of imminent danger, nor the heavy quiet of grief, but something else. The quiet of sheer exhaustion, of survival bought at a terrible price. They moved through the following days in a haze, tending to the remaining animals, clearing debris, assessing the damage. The loss of the hay was a catastrophic blow. Sarah looked at her small herd, their breath pluming in the cold air, and felt a despair deeper than any she had known since Tom's death. Yet, even in the depths of winter, the promise of spring resides. Slowly, almost reluctantly at first, the land began to thaw. The relentless snow receded, revealing the slumbering earth beneath. Rivulets of meltwater trickled down the slopes, carving paths through the remaining drifts. The air softened, carrying the scent of damp earth and, eventually, the first, tentative hints of green pushing through the sodden brown grasses. The sky seemed higher, bluer, and the calls of returning meadowlarks replaced the mournful howl of the wind. Spring was coming to Wyoming, tentative yet unstoppable, and with the changing season came a change in Sarah. The despair didn't vanish overnight, but it gave way to a familiar, stubborn resilience. She stood one morning, looking at the blackened footprint where her hay barn had stood, then turned her gaze to the vast, unfolding landscape. She would not be beaten. This land, Tom's legacy, her sanctuary, would endure. She would endure. She began the back-breaking work of clearing the charred remains, salvaging what little timber she could. Mark, his limp still pronounced, but his strength steadily returning, worked alongside her. He was quiet, his usual taciturn self, but his presence was a steady anchor. He didn't offer empty words of comfort. Instead, he offered the solid support of his labor, sawing wood, hauling debris, his movements economical and efficient. One afternoon, resting on a pile of salvaged logs, Sarah voiced the thought that had been slowly taking shape in her mind. "Can't rebuild it the same," she said, gesturing towards the ruin. "Not enough time before next winter. And maybe it's time for something different." Mark waited, watching her face. "This place," she continued, her gaze sweeping over the valley. "It's on the way north. Trappers, prospectors, sometimes folks heading up towards Montana territory. They pass through the valley sometimes, especially when the lower passes are snowed in late or early." She paused, testing the idea. Maybe not so much cattle, smaller herd, but a place for folks to stop, a way station, a warm meal, a safe place to rest for a night. She looked at Mark then, a question in her eyes. "Takes different work, though. More tending than herding. A garden. Maybe." Mark considered this, rubbing his jaw thoughtfully. "Gardening," he said, the word sounding foreign on his tongue. He looked down at his calloused hands accustomed to the cold steel of a gun, not the warm earth. Then he looked back at Sarah, a faint, almost imperceptible softening in his eyes. "Reckon I could learn. Beats chasing men through blizzards." So, a new beginning started to take shape from the ashes of the old. Mark, surprisingly adept, helped her turn over a patch of earth near the cabin, preparing it for planting once the last threat of frost passed. He might not know a parsnip from a potato, but he learned quickly. His movements precise, his focus absolute. They worked together, finding a new rhythm, not just as survivors, but as partners building something tentative and new. Word of the trouble up at the McGregor place eventually filtered down to Laramie, carried by a trapper who'd seen the smoke from a distance. Weeks later, when the passes were clearer, a small group arrived from town. The sheriff, a portly, well-meaning man named Davies, and a couple of concerned townsfolk. Bringing supplies and offers of help, Sheriff Davies looked around at the recovering ranch, at the formidable woman standing quietly before him, and the scarred, quiet man at her side. He cleared his throat. "Mrs. McGregor." "Mark, we heard there was an incident. We came to see if you needed assistance. Perhaps help relocating back to town until you're back on your feet." Sarah met his gaze evenly. The pity she saw in his eyes, however well-intentioned, stiffened her spine. "Appreciate the supplies, Sheriff, and the concern." Her voice was quiet, but firm. "But we're fine right here." She looked out at the valley, greening under the spring sun. "Folks who choose to live out here. Sheriff, we don't generally need saving. Sometimes, all we need is to be trusted to handle our own affairs." Davies, taken aback by her quiet certainty, could only nod. He left the supplies, exchanged a few awkward pleasantries, and led his small contingent back down the trail, leaving Sarah and Mark to the vast silence and their burgeoning new life. A few weeks later, the mail rider, making his first treacherous trip of the season, brought a letter addressed to Mark's. It bore the postmark of a small town near the southern border. Mark opened it slowly, his expression guarded. He read it standing by the window, the afternoon sun casting long shadows into the cabin. After a long silence, he turned to Sarah, the letter held loosely in his hand. "It's from the sister," he said, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't quite decipher. "The sister of the boy Barker killed." He cleared his throat. She wanted to thank me. Says the circuit judge told her Barker was dealt with, that the folks down there can rest easier now." He looked down at the paper, then back at Sarah. She asked if I knew what happened to him, wondered if he suffered. Sarah came to stand beside him, close enough to feel the tension radiating from him. "What will you tell her?" she asked softly. He shook his head. "Nothing. It's better she doesn't know the particulars. Just that it's over." He folded the letter carefully. That evening, as they sat on the rough-hewn bench outside the cabin, watching the sky bleed into shades of orange and violet behind the western peaks, he read the letter aloud to her. The simple words of gratitude, penned in a neat, hesitant hand, seemed to lift a weight from his shoulders, a burden he hadn't known he carried so heavily. Sarah listened, her heart aching with a complex mix of sorrow and relief, understanding that this letter represented a kind of closure for him, a validation of the grim path he had walked. One soft evening, as the long twilight lingered, Sarah led Mark up the gentle slope behind the cabin. The air was fragrant with pine and damp earth. They stopped beneath a tall, solitary pine tree, its branches whispering in the breeze. A simple, weathered wooden cross marked the spot where Tom rested, overlooking the valley he had loved. Sarah knelt, carefully clearing away a few stray weeds. From a canvas pouch, she took out a small, smooth piece of wood she had painstakingly carved and sanded herself. On it, she had burned the words, "Thomas McGregor. He held this land, so others might find a home." She propped the plaque against the base of the cross, her fingers lingering on the wood. She felt Mark's presence behind her, solid and silent. Sharing this place with him felt right. A quiet acknowledgement of the past and a step towards an uncertain future. Tom had brought her here, had given her this life. His memory was woven into the fabric of the land, but it no longer felt like a barrier. It felt like a foundation. They stood there for a long time, watching the last light fade from the sky, the first stars prickling the deepening blue. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with unspoken understanding. As they turned to leave, Mark stopped her, his hand gently closing over hers. He hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, pressing it into her palm. It was a ring, simple, unadorned, crafted from silver that seemed to glow softly in the twilight. Set into the band was a small, slightly misshapen piece of lead, flattened, scarred, yet somehow beautiful in its imperfection. Sarah recognized it instantly. It was the slug from the bullet she had fired from Tom's old revolver, the bullet that had struck Clay Barker's leg, the shot that had saved her life, that had arguably saved them both. Mark must have retrieved it somehow from the cabin floor after the fight. He had taken that piece of violence, that remnant of fear and desperation, and transformed it into a symbol of something else, something enduring. He didn't speak. No words were needed. His eyes, dark and intense in the fading light, held the question, the hope, the offer of a future shared. Sarah looked down at the ring resting in her palm, then up at Mark's face, his features softened by the twilight and the unspoken emotion that passed between them. She didn't speak either. Instead, she slowly closed her fingers around the ring, then reached out and took his hand, her grip firm, steady. Her answer was there, in her touch, in the quiet acceptance in her eyes. A gentle breeze sighed through the tall grasses of the valley, carrying the scent of pine and wildflowers. Down below, the small herd of cattle grazed peacefully, their dark shapes moving slowly through the deepening shadows. The cabin stood sturdy and welcoming, smoke curling lazily from its chimney, a beacon of warmth against the vast Wild landscape. The ranch, once a place of solitude and sorrow, then a battleground, now stood as something new, not just a place to endure the winter, but a place to begin again, a second chance, a home. What did you think of Sarah and Mark's story? Would you have made the same choices out there in the snow? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment down below. And if you enjoy stories where grit, loss, and love cross paths under a winter sky, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next ride.